Hello third year historians, and welcome to our next lesson in our slave trade topic, which is our National 5 topic. This lesson is the last lesson that we are looking at in terms of the impact of the slave trade on certain areas. Last lesson we were talking about the impact on Britain's cities. In particular, with this lesson we're now going to think about the impact of the slave trade on Britain as a whole, not just on the cities itself. So a lot of this we've kind of already said in the last lesson, and it's about looking over that in a bit more detail. So what you want to be able to do by the end of this lesson is explain how the British economy benefited from the slave trade, and we're going to have a practice at a National 5 skills question to actually finish that off in a wee bit more detail. So the slave trade would not have continued for so long had the merchants, crew and others that were actually involved in it not actually made such a profit from it. It wasn't until returning to Britain, however, during the slave trade voyage, that the true wealth of a journey became clear. You didn't actually know whether or not your journey had been successful and you'd made a lot of money, or you had actually lost a lot of money. So for example, for this, if you were buying 412 slaves in Africa, which was about £21 a slave, you were having to spend £9,000 to buy these slaves. Out of the number of them that survive the Middle Passage, you lose some. You only have 392 by the time they get to that. You have roughly then got to sell them for about £107 a slave, which gives you £42,000 back. You then have to take away the cost of trading, the pay for the crew and things like that, which was, say, roughly about 26,000, and the total profit for the slave owner was actually then about £7,000, which doesn't seem like an awful lot for one journey for a long time. This would obviously be higher or lower depending on how many slaves actually survived, on how much money you got for the slaves, but that is an equivalent of about £4.5 million today that they would be making on each slave journey. And it's not always going to be that. Sometimes it would be significantly less, sometimes it would be no profit whatsoever, but that is roughly based on just kind of average numbers that a slave merchant would actually get. So very, very profitable for the slaves, for the slave merchants. Now previously, when we've talked about the impacts of the slave trade, we've talked about how it had both positive and negatives. Most of the impacts on Britain are positive. It's all about these positive impacts on British economy, on the jobs of people in Britain, on the wealth of the people and the wealth of the cities and things. Whereas there are some more negative elements that we're not talking about in too much detail here, which are things like the continued development of racism and things like that. So, benefit number one then is money. Benefit to the economy. Now, export markets flourished in Britain. They were able to profit from selling items that were grown on the plantations. That money was then used for investment in other industries. They made money from taxes on luxury goods. Roughly in about 1770, the annual profit the slave trade kind of brought in was about £3.8 million to Britain. This is about £450 million a day. Okay, so this is annually they're bringing in that much money to Britain. Obviously this means that out of all of the impacts and the benefits of the slave trade, the economy and the money is the number one benefit. Benefit number two is about industry. So the Industrial Revolution happened thanks to the profits of the slave trade. Factories were created which made goods from things like the cotton that was grown on the plantations. We said about Lanarkshire being involved in that. The fishing industries thrived because fishermen caught fish that could now be sold overseas, which meant that they actually made a lot of money as well. Shipbuilding industry developed and thrived in places like Glasgow and in other places, which was fantastic for later on as well, but made a lot of money. Other industries like the cooperage industry flourished, which is making barrels for transporting fish and other goods, like you can see here. So more and more people were employed as coopers to make the barrels. It provided work for thousands of other people in different places. So you can see here even women and men working side by side on these barrels, building them, making them, filling them and things like that. Goods were produced, obviously, which could then be sold in Britain or overseas, other than just the fish, lots of other things. It gave the helping hand to the Industrial Revolution by not only providing the wealth for investment in it, so for example a factory owner could invest his profits into new steam sort of machinery and things like that, so that modernised, made his factory quicker, more effective, but also investing in the fact that they were going to make more goods, so it might be a new product or something like that. But also it provided a market for manufactured goods, which meant more and more factories would be more likely to be opened purely to make things for the slave trade industry and the market that it was developing. So for example, bottles were needed to carry rum. Whitehaven in Cumbria grew really rich making this Jamaican rum from the rum and molasses being sent to them. They made the bottles, they bottled it, packaged it and sold it, made an awful lot of money off of that. The slave trade also helped to pay for things like infrastructure, which is the building of roads and canals, as well as the development of docks and ports, which we've said. Cotton mills in places like Manchester and Wigan, for example. Lanarkshire grew until a large area of cotton mills making cloth, we said that as well. Copper smelting in cities like Birmingham to make pots, which were then traded in Africa. That was a lot of money being brought in there. They also had in Birmingham over 4,000 gun makers, with 100,000 guns a year going to the slave traders to be traded in Africa. Benefit number 3 then is jobs. The sugar factory workers processed the sugar that was grown on the plantation. So for example, Tate and Lyle, you can see, are still there today, which were in Greenock and in Liverpool. They are still a sugar plantation, not plantation owners, but still a sugar product that you can buy in shops today. Iron workers made the manacles and the chains which held the slaves, so made a lot of money off of that. Shipbuilding, you need people to build the ships that the slaves were transported in. So in Liverpool, London and Glasgow, there was a lot of people employed to literally just build ships. The coopers, we said, made barrels to transport herring and other fish to the plantations and to other places around the world, which was lots of jobs for them. Dockers, for the first time, also working in the dockyards where the ships were housed, moving the goods back and forward. Warehouse workers working in the warehouses, storing the goods in the plantations. In finance and things like that, people were starting to work in banks or trading houses, insurance companies opening up like Lloyd's of London, which provided the credit and insurance for the slave traders. They needed people to work in them as well. Fishermen now feeding the slaves with fish that they were catching, so more and more people needed fish. Factory workers for the cotton grown on the plantations, or for just any other goods, factories opening all over the place that needed workers. Benefit number 4 then are luxury goods. Things that were grown that were brought back, and that are things like sugar, obviously tobacco, rice, coffee, rum and cotton, which could be used and bought by people. In Britain, it was because you were now working, more employment, you had more money to spend, which meant you could afford these luxury goods. So it was no longer just the wealthy people who were actually getting to enjoy these products, it was everybody. Benefit number 5 is housing, buildings being built, and we talked about that briefly. Profits from the slave trade or industries linked to it, such as tobacco, led to the investment in building mansions and other important buildings. So schools, museums, hospitals, all of this benefiting people more widely. Sometimes there was donations from people involved in the slave trade to build these things because they felt they should give back. Another good example that we've talked about is the Shawfield Mansion in Glasgow, which you can see here. Another example is Harewood House near Leeds in West Yorkshire. This is Harewood House here, which we were just talking about. Absolutely gorgeous. It was built for one family from profits from owning slave plantations in Barbados and Jamaica, and is still there today. So if you're ever in Leeds, go visit it. It's got really lovely gardens, and these were built purely as a profit from the slave trade. Benefit number 6 was education. Some of those who profited from slavery then invested their money in education, such as Alexander Milnes from Moray. Alexander Milne left roughly about £100,000 or dollars for a school to be built for the boys and girls of the area he was born and grew up in, which is actually still there today. Milne's primary school, which is here, you can see the building, very nice one. There was also other places that obviously opened and built schools as well. Okay, so just like we did in the last couple of lessons where we are building a grid, at the end, you're going to use this grid to kind of summarise what these main benefits to the economy was for your notes. And this is what we're going to use here. Now with this one, you're going to need a couple of extra squares, which we're going to use to kind of give you some key 6 summary points, which we're going to use in future for explain questions or things like that. So for this one, you're going to set up your grid using the next couple of slides to fill it in. In total, you're going to need about 15 squares, which includes this one and the next slide. And we'll highlight just the key things that you need to put into this as we kind of go. So the slave trade resulted in raw materials being shipped to the UK, and from this jobs were created in order to manufacture the goods. So we could even just say the slave trade resulted in raw materials being shipped to the UK, and from this jobs were created. British industry benefited by supplying factory-made goods in exchange for slaves in Africa, and you could give your examples in this one as well, so we do need all of this one. It created jobs in regards to the slave voyages, e.g. in the docks, and you could add in some more examples if you want. It resulted in the development of financial services like loans, which we've already said in the last one, so that's enough, but you could put the example as Barclays. It resulted in the development of financial services like insurance, and you can put the example of Lloyds. The government made a lot of money from taxes associated with the slave trade, and you could give the example if you wanted to. Due to the number of people who moved to the Caribbean, certain industries benefited from their want of British goods. Between 1630 and 1807, the British slave merchants alone made profits of £12 million a year on selling slaves. Thus many people were wealthier and could buy the luxury goods, which created thousands of jobs in places like coffee houses. Many wealthy merchants invested their profits in banks, insurance companies, cotton industry and engineering companies. Again, these investments created jobs. So quite a bit to write there for your notes. So pause the video here, fill in your version of the grid or the mind map, whatever you're doing, and then move the video to the next slide or next section for the last couple of boxes. So for this one, it just summarises the key sort of 6 areas that we're developing here. So financially, money is the most obvious benefit from the trade. Goods, so being part of the slave trade gave Britons access to the goods that slave traders sold. In terms of employment, slavery created jobs in Britain. And we're going to just add in there, it also helped provide money to fund the Industrial Revolution. Population wise, an impact was that Britain's population changed and grew thanks to the availability of slave trade jobs, such as Liverpool. We said that their population boomed. Militarily, Britain's military was stronger due to slavery because they could build slave ships, which led to improvements in military vessel design This one you need the whole bit from. We've not talked about this one too much. The tax money raised in Britain built a bigger navy, and navy sailors also gained navigation experience as slave ship hands. So they could go on a slave ship for a couple of journeys and then join the navy, and that gave them this experience. In terms of cities and people, the cities and people across Britain also became rich thanks to the slave trade. And this is not just the ones that are selling it. This is the people involved back in Britain who had never stepped foot on a ship, never went to Africa, never did anything like that at all. They were able to get jobs, which gave them more money as well. So pause this one here, add this one to your grid or to your mind map, however you're doing it for your notes, and then move the video to the next task. So, anagram summary, summarise the impact of the slave trade on the British economy. The words down at the bottom are there for you to use, and you could write this out in your jotter if you want, or you could just do it in your head and work it out. If we were doing this in class, we'll do it together, but you can write this in. You don't have to send a photo of it, but it's a nice way to kind of summarise what we just talked about. Okay, so your activity for this is a how fully skills question. We've been given this source. In a how fully question at National 5 level, you will be given a source and you're going to be asked how fully does that source either explain or describe something. And in this case, it's explaining the importance of the slave trade to Britain's economy. If the question asks you to explain, what you're looking for are reasons. So in this case, it's reasons why the slave trade was important to Britain's economy. If this question asked you to describe, it would just be facts, things that you could just add in. So we're looking for reasons. So now that we know what we're looking for, we have to actually read the source and decide what things are reasons that the slave trade was important to the British economy. So as we read it, we can kind of see these things that we've now highlighted are key reasons. So the slave trade was considered essential to Britain's economy in the 18th century. Yes, it was, but that is not a reason. So we are going to just take that out because it's not a reason that helps us explain why it was important. We know that it was essential, that means it is important, but it's not a reason why, so we take it out. For example, examples we don't need, so we take that out as well, but now we've got some key bits. So it says the slave trade had raised Liverpool from a struggling port to one of the richest and most prosperous trading centres in the world. That is a reason why the slave trade was important to Liverpool, so we highlight that as something we might want to use in a couple of minutes when we write our answer. The next sentence, again, a really good reason. The slave trade provided work in almost every industry in the town, so again, perfect, that's a reason it provides work. Again, the next one, slave cotton provided work for the mills of Lanarkshire, so that's a specific place. Lanarkshire provided work in those mills, that's a reason, so we want that one too. However, the next bit, however little thought was given to the suffering of those involved in its production, that is true, but it isn't a reason why it was a benefit to Britain, so we take that one out. We don't want it. Merchants made huge profits importing sugar from the Caribbean. Yes, they did, so we want that one as well. A product which was in great demand. It was in great demand, we could add that in, but we're just going to take it out just now. So this tells me that I have at least 4 things that I could say in this how fully question moving forward. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at how the how fully question is structured at National 5, and then we're going to come back to this highlighted bit of our source and we're going to use this to answer the question. So at National 5, these questions are worth 6 marks. There's a couple of things that we need to do to make sure that you obviously pick up the marks in the question. First of all, you have to start by answering the question. You write a sentence that answers it by saying something like quite fully but not totally, and you put a full stop. Full stops are your friends with these particular questions. Then what you're doing is you're looking for up to 3 things from the source. The source says these 3 things, and then you're looking for 4 things or 3 things that the source doesn't say. If you can only find 2 things from the source, you need to then make sure that you put 4 things from your own knowledge that the source doesn't say to make up your 6 marks. And this is how you're going to build your marks up. So you can either do 3 and 3, or you can do 2 and 4, but you'll never ever get any more than 4 marks for points from your own knowledge, and you'll never get any more than 3 marks for things from the source. So I would stick to the rule of 3 and 3, but if you can only find 2, you then need to add an extra thing in from your own head. The really key thing for these questions are they need to be answered in the first sentence. If you only do one of these things, so if you only give what the source says but you don't answer the question and you don't give at least 1 point from your own head, you can only get 2 marks. You're not going to get all of the marks available even if you say 3 things. So you have to make sure that you follow it very carefully, and to help you do this we have a mnemonic. So when we answer the question, we use AID to help us remember how to do this. So A for AID starts with our answer. Answer the question with our first sentence. The source quite fully explains or describes whatever it says and take what the question says, but misses out some key points, and then put a full stop. We then work on the I in AID, which is includes. So 3 things the source says, and all you've got to do is say the source says, put a quote, and then tell us why you've put that quote. So the source states this thing, this tells me, this means, and then just give a little bit of information. You're not putting the whole quote in your own words, you're just explaining why you've picked it up. You do this 3 times. And then we have our doesn't include. So the things that the source doesn't tell us. It might be something you remember from this lesson, it could be something you've got in your notes just now. Anything the source doesn't say that you know fits in with what this question is asking you. And again, you're looking for 3 things to do that. So if we go back to this question, which is the how fully question on the importance of the slave trade to Britain's economy, remember we read through it, and these are the bits that we picked as the key bits that give us reasons, because it's an explained question, for the importance of the slave trade to Britain's economy. What we're going to do now is we're going to take these reasons and we're going to write them out as an answer to this how fully skill. So we start with our A. Source B quite fully explains the importance of the slave trade to Britain's economy, because that's what the question's asking, that's our answer, and we put a full stop. You can copy that answer in for this activity if you want just now, or you can reword it your own way, whatever you want to do, but that's our answer and our A for AID. We then do what the source says. So the source says includes the slave trade had raised Liverpool from a struggling port to one of the richest and most prosperous trading centres in the world, which means that a lot of profit was made for the city, making it really wealthy. So I've taken my quote and I've said why I've picked it. The source also says the slave trade provided work in almost every industry in the town. This shows that there were many job opportunities for everyone involved in the slave trade. Finally, the source also says merchants made huge profits importing sugar from the Caribbean. This shows how important tropical crops were. So you can pause the video and you can write these things out. That would give us our 3 including marks, so what the source is actually telling us, which means we have managed to get 3 marks up to this point, and we now need to do the things the source doesn't include to get our next 3. So pause it, write this one out, and then move on to the next slide or the next section of the video to find out how to do the next part. So now we're going to look for 3 things that you can add in from your own memory. And we start this with a really key simple sentence saying, however, the source misses out some key details. For example, it doesn't say, and then you tell me something. Then you write, also the source misses out, and you tell me something else. Finally, the source didn't say anything about, and you tell me something else there. So you're going to pick 3 things from the list below and put them into your own words. So you could talk about the importance of tobacco being a big part of Glasgow's economy. You could talk about the economy of Glasgow later shifting to the processing of sugar. You could talk about jobs being provided in particular industries like shipbuilding and things like that. You could talk about profits from the slave trade being invested in British industries. You could talk about wealthy colonial families building huge mansions and give an example. You could talk about the profits from the slave trade being invested in the development of British towns and cities. And you can talk about many important civic buildings in British cities being constructed using the profits from the slave trade, for example, hospitals, museums, schools, things like that. So you're going to pick 3 things, any 3 things, and you're going to write out the answer that we've done so far and finish it off using these things to help you. If you've got any questions, ask in the team, ask your teacher, and this is going to be your assignment for this lesson. Finish the question and upload it to get a mark.